Hey guys, tonight we're sailing into the disturbing, oddly bureaucratic, and occasionally strangely fair world of punishment under the pirate code, the marooning, the lash, the price tag pirates put on a missing leg, and the single largest pirate trial in recorded history, where 52 men hanged in a span of days on the coast of West Africa in 1722. We'll talk about what could get you flogged, what could get you marooned on a sandbar with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol, and what, strangely enough, could get you a cash payout larger than anything the Royal Navy would ever offer a wounded sailor. Welcome aboard a ship where the rules were written down, voted on, and more often than you'd expect, actually followed. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and if you'd like some ambience, let a fan hum low in the background like wind moving through rigging you can't quite see. You're warm right now, tucked in, still. That won't be true for the men we're about to meet. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture a man standing on the deck of a 90-gun, turned pirate frigate anchored somewhere off the West African coast, a quill in his shaking hand, and a piece of paper in front of him that will decide, more than any other document he will ever sign, how he lives and how he might die. The ship is the Royal Fortune. The year is 1721. The captain waiting for his signature is Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age. A man who by the time of his death the following year would take somewhere between 400 and 600 vessels, a number so large that historians still round it off, because nobody, including Roberts, seems to have kept a precise final tally. The paper in front of the new man isn't a contract in the modern sense, it's the ship's articles. And what's remarkable about it, before we even get to what it says, is that it exists at all. Here's the thing people tend to miss about pirates. We picture chaos, men screaming, swords out, no rules, every soul for himself. The reality preserved in trial records and in Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account of pirate lives, a source we'll come back to more than once tonight, and one worth treating carefully, since its own authorship is disputed and it's known to have dramatised events, is that most Golden Age pirate crews operated under a written constitution. Voted on, signed, occasionally sworn over a Bible or a hatchet, depending on the ship and how devout anyone was feeling that afternoon. Roberts's articles, as Johnson preserved them, ran to 11 clauses covering everything from gambling to candle hours to what happened if you lost a leg in a fight. Every man aboard, including Roberts himself, was bound by them. That's the detail that should stop you. The captain didn't get to skip the fine print. So how does a man end up signing his name to a document like this in the first place? Sometimes he walked up and asked to. Piracy, brutal as it was, often paid better and fairer shares than merchant service, where a sailor could work a 14-hour day for a captain who owed him nothing beyond his wage and owed him that wage late. Other times, and this happened more often than the romantic version of pirate history likes to admit, a man was forced, taken off a captured merchant vessel because the pirates needed his particular skill, a carpenter, a navigator, a surgeon, and told to sign, or else. The articles even had a clause for this. Forced men could, in theory, argue their case later, if captured by the authorities, claim they signed under duress, never took a full share, never fired on the king's colours, and some genuinely were acquitted on exactly that defence. We'll meet a batch of them later tonight, standing trial on a stretch of West African coastline, their lives depending on whether a court believed the word forced. But for now, picture the quill again. The new man reads, or has read to him, since plenty of sailors in this era couldn't read at all, the clauses that will govern the rest of his time aboard. No striking another man aboard ship. Every man to have a vote in matters of importance. Desertion in battle punished by death or marooning, the crew's choice. Candles out at 8 in the evening, drink taken after that hour only on the open deck. Gaming at cards or dice for money strictly forbidden, which, if you think about it, is a genuinely funny rule to find on a pirate ship. A crew of armed robbers who nonetheless decided that betting your neighbour's wages away was a step too far. Compensation scheduled out by injury, so precisely that losing your right arm carried a set price in coin, not a vague promise of the captain's goodwill. And running beneath every clause, the same quiet, radical idea that punishment aboard this ship would not be one man's whim. It would be the law the crew itself had written and agreed to be bound by, months before anyone actually broke it. This is the story of the Pirate Articles, the document that turned a floating crime into something closer to a constitution, and the reason that everything grim and strange we're about to walk through tonight, the lash, the marooning, the payout for a missing eye, wasn't chaos at all. It was procedure. And procedure, it turns out, can be every bit as unsettling as chaos, once you understand exactly what it allowed. Roberts wasn't the first to draft articles like these, and he wouldn't be the last. The custom stretched back at least to the buccaneers of the mid-1600s, raiders operating out of places like Tortuga and Port Royal, who developed their own rough codes for splitting plunder and settling disputes before a voyage ever left port, a practice sometimes called, retrospectively, the custom of the coast. By the time the Golden Age crews of the 1710s and 1720s picked it up, the articles had become something closer to standard equipment. A new captain didn't just need a ship, he needed a document. Historians studying these codes, the economist Peter Leeson wrote an entire academic analysis of pirate governance in the 2000s, arguing that pirates built these systems for the same reason any organisation does, because unchecked authority is bad for business when your business depends on several dozen armed men trusting each other not to knife them in their sleep, have pointed out that the article solved a very specific problem. A pirate captain had almost no legal recourse if his own crew mutinied against him. He couldn't call the local magistrate, he couldn't appeal to a naval court. The only thing holding a pirate crew together was the crew's own agreement to be held together, and the articles were how you wrote that agreement down before the first crisis tested it. Every ship's articles were a little different, tailored to that crew and that captain, but certain features recur often enough across the surviving copies, Roberts's articles, the ones from John Phillips's Revenge in 1724, others scattered through trial depositions, that we can talk about them as a genuine pattern rather than a handful of coincidences. The vote sat at the centre of nearly all of them. The captain was elected, not appointed, chosen by majority vote of the crew. And, this is the part that tends to surprise people, he could be voted out again. Johnson records that aboard many pirate ships, the captain's absolute authority was reserved strictly for combat, for the chaos of an actual engagement when someone needed to give orders instantly and be obeyed instantly. The rest of the time, on questions of where to sail, whom to attack, how to divide the take, the crew voted, and the captain's voice counted for exactly one vote among many. Contrast that for a moment with a Royal Navy ship of the same decade, where the captain's word was law by royal commission, where a sailor could be flogged for looking at an officer the wrong way, and where there was no vote of any kind, ever, about anything. The pirate ship, run by outlaws, was in some structural sense more democratic than the King's Navy. That is not a comfortable fact for anyone who wants pirates to be simple villains, and it isn't meant to be. It's simply what the paperwork says. Alongside the captain, the crew elected a quartermaster, arguably the more powerful role day to day, since the quartermaster controlled the distribution of food and plunder, adjudicated disputes between crew members, and in many cases administered punishment under the articles, functioning as something between a foreman, a judge, and what some later writers have called the ship's sea attorney. If you had a grievance against another crewman, you didn't go to the captain, you went to the quartermaster. If you were caught stealing from the common stock, it was very often the quartermaster who decided your fate, working from the clause the whole crew had already signed off on, not from any personal temper he happened to be in that day. That last point matters more than it might seem to at first. A punishment carried out under the articles wasn't an angry captain lashing out, sometimes literally, in a fit of rage. It was a sentence, decided in advance, agreed to by every signature on the page, applied afterward without much room for negotiation. which sounds almost reassuring in a strange way, until you actually get to what those sentences were. Losing a fight on deck could cost you 40 lashes on the bare back, a number lifted, according to Johnson's account, directly from Mosaic law, a scrap of Old Testament justice repurposed by armed robbers on the high seas, which tells you something about how thoroughly these men saw themselves as operating a legitimate legal system rather than simply doing whatever they pleased. Robbing the common stock, concealing plunder from your fellow crew rather than turning it in to be divided by share, could get you marooned, left alive on some deserted spit of coastline with almost nothing. A sentence more feared by most pirates, if the record is any guide, than a quick death. And smuggling a woman aboard the ship in disguise, one of Roberts's specific clauses, was punishable by death. We'll spend real time on all three of those tonight, because knowing that a punishment existed on paper is a very different thing from understanding what it actually meant to live under it, day after day, watch after watch, waiting to see whether the rules would hold. The articles John Phillips drew up for his ship the Revenge in 1724, preserved in the trial record of his own eventual capture, rather than solely through Johnson's more embellished account, give us one of the clearest surviving points of comparison to Roberts's, and the differences between the two documents are almost as instructive as their similarities. Phillips's articles specify their own compensation figures, their own list of prohibited behaviours, their own graduated scale of punishment, drafted independently of Roberts by a different captain running a much smaller operation, and yet arriving at strikingly similar solutions to strikingly similar problems, proof, if any more were needed, that these weren't isolated eccentricities dreamed up by one unusually organised captain, but a genuine, convergent pattern repeating itself across crew after crew that had never so much as met each other. Charles Vane and George Lowther, two other captains operating in these same waters during the same rough decade, are recorded in various trial depositions and captured correspondence as having maintained comparable systems aboard their own ships, even as their reputations for personal cruelty toward captives varied enormously from one to the next. A captain could be, by every account, a genuinely vicious man toward the merchant crews he captured and preyed upon, and still run his own ship according to a code his men experienced as scrupulously, procedurally fair. Those two facts sit uncomfortably next to each other, and the historical record simply doesn't let you resolve the discomfort by deciding one version of the man was the real one and the other a mask. The vote itself, mechanically, deserves a moment of attention too, because it wasn't the single dramatic gesture the word might suggest, no grand assembly convened only at moments of crisis, but rather a running feature of everyday shipboard decision-making, invoked constantly across the length of a voyage. Whether to pursue a sighted sail or let it pass, whether to careen the ship for repairs now, at some risk of discovery, or press on and risk the hull's condition worsening, whether to accept a captured vessel into the fleet as a prize to be sailed onward, or strip her of anything useful and let her go. A decision that came up again and again across a successful captain's career, and one that, per several surviving accounts, was put to a genuine show of hands each time, rather than decided unilaterally by whoever happened to be captain that month. Johnson's account claims that aboard at least some crews, a captain who tried to make major decisions without consulting the company risked exactly the kind of vote that had put him in command in the first place working in reverse. A deposition, sometimes bloodless, sometimes not, replacing him with whichever officer the crew judged more trustworthy going forward. It's this feature, more than any single clause about compensation or punishment, that historians studying pirate governance keep returning to as the genuinely structural heart of the whole system. Not that pirates were kind to each other, which the marooning of men like Edward England should already have complicated for you, but that they built almost universally a mechanism for checking their own leadership's power, before that power could curdle into the kind of unaccountable authority every one of them had fled a merchant ship or a naval commission to escape in the first place. That's really the question this whole night is built around. Not simply what pirates were punished for, though we'll cover a great deal of that, but what it felt like to serve under a code that promised fairness in the abstract while delivering something far more physical and far more final in the specific. A crew that voted for its captain also voted, at least once, to leave a man on an island with a bottle of fresh water and a loaded pistol, and meant it as mercy compared to the alternative. A code that paid out real coin for a missing leg also flogged a man raw for a fistfight over a card game that technically shouldn't have been happening in the first place, since gambling was banned. The articles were not a system of pure cruelty, and they were not a system of pure fairness. They were something messier and more human than either, written by frightened, ambitious, often desperate men trying to build something that would hold together long enough to get them all home rich, or at least alive. So tonight, we're going to walk that ship deck by deck, clause by clause, punishment by punishment. We'll spend a full voyage inside the skin of a new recruit learning the code the hard way. We'll stand on the sand with a man who broke the unwritten rule of showing his enemies too much mercy. We'll watch the lash come down and understand exactly why the quartermaster counted each stroke aloud. We'll look at the strange, almost tender arithmetic pirates used to compensate a man for a missing eye or a missing leg, an arithmetic more generous in cold hard numbers than anything the Royal Navy offered its own wounded. And we'll end where the story of Bartholomew Roberts's crew actually ended, on a stretch of coastline in what is now Ghana, in a trial larger than any pirate trial before or since, where the very same articles these men had signed in good faith would be read back to them by judges who had absolutely no intention of honouring the same spirit of fairness the pirates themselves had tried to build. That trial is still a year away from the story we're about to live through. Before any of these men see the gallows or the mines, they have to survive the ship itself, and that means learning the code not as a document read once at signing, but as a set of rules that governs every hour of every day, whether you like it or not. You sign your name, or make your mark, since reading was never a requirement for piracy, on a set of ship's articles at Nassau in the year 1718, in the crowded, palm-shadowed harbour that pirates of the era had more or less turned into their own unregulated republic. You didn't plan on this life. 3 months ago you were a rigger on a merchant sloop out of Bristol, underpaid and overworked, until your ship was taken by men flying no colours at all until the very last minute. The pirate quartermaster looked you over, asked what you could do, and told you that you had a choice. Sign the articles and take a share, or stay behind on the merchant vessel with the other men who declined. You signed. Most men in your position did. The parchment in front of you lists 11 clauses, more or less, depending on which captain drafted them, and a man reads them aloud for the benefit of everyone who can't make out the letters themselves. You listen carefully, because your life is about to depend on remembering every word of it. Equal vote. In affairs of moment. Equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors. No gaming at cards or dice for money. Candles to be put out at 8 at night. Every man to keep his weapon clean and ready for action. Desertion of the ship or quarters in battle, punished by death or marooning. No striking one another aboard. Disputes to be settled ashore by sword and pistol. And near the bottom, the clause that makes several of the newer men shift uncomfortably where they stand. Compensation for the loss of a limb, paid out of the common stock before any general division of the plunder. You sign. You are now officially a pirate, bound by a document you had no hand in writing, but every intention of honouring, because the alternative breaking articles you'd sworn to, carries consequences you're about to spend the next several months learning firsthand. Welcome to the Fortune's Revenge, a 200-ton former merchant sloop now carrying 14 guns and about 80 men. You're home for however long this voyage lasts. Beside you at the rail stands a thin, sunburned man named Barnaby Quill, not a documented historical figure. Just one composite face among the many forced and volunteer men who made up crews like this one, but as real to the story as any of them, because his kind of story happened again and again across dozens of ships whose full crew lists never survived. Barnaby's a cooper by trade, taken off a Portuguese merchantman 2 voyages back because the ship needed someone who could keep its water casks watertight, which turns out to matter more than cannon fire on a voyage that might run 4 months without touching land. Barnaby's been aboard long enough to know the code better than you do, and he's the one who leans over and tells you, not unkindly, that the rules aren't decoration. Man went overboard for gambling 3 weeks before you came aboard, he says. Not overboard as in drowned. Overboard as in the quartermaster put him ashore on the next spit of sand we passed, with a bottle of water and his own bad luck for company. You file that away. It will matter later. 3 weeks out of Nassau, you learn your first real lesson in shipboard law, and it has nothing to do with combat. 2 men, a gunner named Hollis and a Welsh former fisherman, everyone calls Owen the Second, since there's already an Owen aboard, get into a dispute over a card game that shouldn't have been happening at all, since gambling for money was expressly forbidden in the articles you signed. Hollis accuses Owen of marking the deck. Owen calls Hollis a liar in front of a dozen witnesses. On a merchant ship, this ends with an officer shouting both men back to work. Here, it ends differently. Striking a man aboard ship is forbidden. The articles are explicit on this point, precisely because a fight in cramped quarters can turn into a general brawl in seconds, and a general brawl on a ship this size could sink careers, reputations, and occasionally the ship itself. So Hollis and Owen are told, calmly by the quartermaster, that their quarrel will be settled ashore. Not now. Not here. When the ship next makes landfall, the 2 of them will step out with pistol and sword under the eyes of witnesses from the crew, and whatever happens, happens fairly, according to a duel with agreed rules rather than a knife in the dark. You watch both men go quiet and pale at the prospect. There's something almost worse, you realise, about having weeks to think about a fight you know is coming than there would be about a fight that simply happened and ended. Here's the thing about the code you're only beginning to understand. It wasn't built to be gentle. It was built to be predictable. And predictability, it turns out, is its own kind of mercy, when the alternative is a crew of 80 armed, exhausted, frightened men left to settle every grievance however violence first suggests itself. 6 weeks out, you take your first prize, a Dutch merchant snow loaded with sugar and dyewood, captured without a shot fired once her captain sees your guns run out and your numbers on deck. The prize goes smoothly enough, but it's here you learn about the article's most unforgiving clause, the one about concealing plunder from the common stock. Every man who boards the captured vessel to search her hold knows, or is quickly reminded, that anything found, coin, jewellery, fine cloth, anything worth taking, belongs to the company as a whole, to be divided later according to the shares laid out in the articles, not pocketed quietly by whoever happens to find it first. A boatswain's mate named Croft is caught, 3 days later, with a woman's gold locket sewn into the lining of his coat, taken from the Dutch captain's cabin and never reported. Croft swears he forgot it was there. Nobody believes him, least of all the quartermaster, who reminds the assembled crew in a voice pitched to carry that concealing goods from the company is a marooning offence, the same sentence Barnaby told you about back in Nassau. Croft is given one chance: return the locket, add it to the common stock, and take his lashes instead of the island. He takes the lashes. You don't yet know what that looks like in practice. You're about to find out, because the sentence is carried out publicly, the next morning at 8 bells, with the whole crew mustered to watch. By the time you've been aboard 2 months, you've come to understand something Barnaby tried to tell you back in the first week, and that you only half believed then. The articles cut both ways. Yes, they can put you ashore on a sandbar or lay 40 stripes across your back. But they also mean that when the ship's carpenter loses 2 fingers to a jammed capstan during a squall off the windward passage, the crew doesn't simply shrug and let him bleed into obscurity. The articles specify a payment, a sum in pieces of 8, agreed on before anyone was ever injured, paid out of the plunder before the general division, because the men who wrote this document understood. in a way that most merchant captains and naval officers of their era conspicuously did not, that a crew that doesn't compensate its wounded is a crew that will not fight hard when the moment comes. You watch the carpenter, a broad, quiet man named Aldous, receive his payment in front of the whole crew, counted out coin by coin from the common chest, and you notice something you didn't expect to notice. Several of the men nearby look relieved, not just for Aldous, but for themselves. The rule that just paid him is the same rule that will pay you. If your turn comes, that, more than any pistol or any flag, might be the actual thing holding 80 desperate men together on a 200-ton sloop in the middle of an ocean that doesn't care whether any of you live. 3 months out of Nassau, and you've come to understand the rhythm of the code the way you once understood the rhythm of tides back home. Candles out at 8, and if you're caught drinking below decks after that hour, you'll answer for it. Not because the captain is a temperance man, God knows he isn't, but because an open flame below decks among barrels of gunpowder is the single fastest way to turn a pirate crew into scattered wreckage. And the men who wrote this clause had almost certainly watched it happen to someone else's ship. Weapons kept clean and ready at all times, checked, according to Barnaby, at unpredictable intervals by the quartermaster himself, because a pistol that misfires in a boarding action gets you killed just as dead as one you never carried at all, and running beneath everything, the quiet understanding that every man aboard, from the captain down to the powder boys barely into their teens, is bound by the same 11 clauses, subject to the same 40 stripes, eligible for the same compensation, entitled to the same single vote. 9 months out, the ship takes what turns out to be the richest prize of the entire voyage, a heavily laden merchantman out of Cartagena carrying silver plate and coin bound for Spain. Taken after a brief exchange of fire that leaves 2 of your own crew wounded and none dead, a stroke of fortune everyone aboard seems to feel in their bones as unusually lucky. What follows isn't the free-for-all scramble the word plunder tends to conjure in the imagination. It's a ceremony, almost, conducted according to the exact share structure laid out in the articles you signed back in Nassau, the captain and the quartermaster each receiving a larger allotment, typically something in the range of 1.5 to 2 shares apiece, in recognition of their responsibilities, while ordinary crewmen like you receive a single share each, and specialists like Aldous the carpenter or the ship's surgeon receive something in between, a share and a quarter or a share and a half, depending on the specific articles this crew agreed to. Boys and those newest to the voyage sometimes receive a fraction of a full share, a half or a quarter, their smaller allotment tied not to any judgment about their worth as men, but simply to the length of time they'd been aboard contributing to the voyage's risks and its costs. You watch the quartermaster count the division out publicly, on deck, in front of the whole muster. Exactly the same procedural, unhurried manner he used counting out Hollis's 40 stripes months earlier. The same careful witnessed arithmetic applied equally to punishment and reward, because a crew that suspected its officers of skimming the plunder before division would collapse just as quickly as one that suspected its captain of administering punishment unfairly. Trust, on this ship, runs on visible, countable procedure in both directions at once, the good and the grim alike laid open for every man aboard to see and, if he chose, to challenge. It's a strange kind of comfort, living under a law this exacting. You didn't choose this life, not really, not the way the songs and the stories will one day claim men like you chose it. But you did choose when the quill was put in your hand back in Nassau Harbour to be bound by something with rules, rather than adrift in something with none. Whether that will be enough to bring you home again is a different question entirely, and the code, for all its clauses, has no answer written down for that one. Whether the code was enough to bring any given man home again was never really the code's problem to solve. Its job was narrower than that, to decide, when someone broke it badly enough, exactly what happened next. And of every punishment written into a pirate's articles, one was feared more consistently, across more ships than the lash, more than the duel ashore, more by most accounts than death itself. It was reserved for the worst offences the code recognised, and it turned an entire island, however small, into a sentence. The sun over the Isle of Mauritius in 1721 is the kind of relentless that makes a man's skin blister through his shirt within the hour, and Edward England has been standing in it since morning, watching his own ship sail away without him. England is not a young man by pirate standards. He spent years building a reputation as one of the more capable and, by the standards of his profession, more restrained captains operating in the waters off Madagascar and the African coast. A man who took prizes without unnecessary bloodshed when he could manage it. That restraint is precisely why he's standing on this beach now, watching the Fancy and the Victory shrink toward the horizon under a crew that no longer wants him. His own quartermaster, a man named John Taylor, along with a captain called Jasper Cigar, or in some records simply given as another name entirely. The sources here are thin and second-hand, pieced together well after the fact, led the vote that put him ashore. His crime in the eyes of the men who sentenced him wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. Several months earlier, England had captured an East India Company ship called the Cassandra, and against the wishes of a faction of his own crew who wanted the captured captain, a man named Alexander McCrae, killed outright for the fierce resistance he'd put up. England let McCrae live, and even helped him get away with a portion of his ship intact. His crew never forgave him for it. They marooned him for the crime of showing his enemy too much decency. This is the story of marooning, the punishment written into nearly every set of pirate articles that survives in the historical record, and the sentence that turns out to reveal more about pirate justice than the noose ever could, because unlike execution, marooning was a punishment designed to leave the question of survival entirely up to the condemned man himself. The mechanics of marooning followed a rough but consistent pattern across the accounts that have come down to us, whether from Johnson's general history, from trial depositions, or from the handful of survivors who lived to describe it afterward. The condemned man, and it was almost always a man, since so few women sailed under pirate articles in the first place, was rowed to some isolated, often uninhabited stretch of coastline, or a small island too far from shipping lanes to expect rescue anytime soon. He was left with a strictly limited kit, a small quantity of gunpowder and shot, sometimes a single pistol, and critically, water, often specified in the articles as no more than a bottle. Some versions of the custom, particularly on ships that wanted the punishment to carry at least a token chance of survival, left slightly more. A hatchet for building shelter or gathering firewood, perhaps a length of rope. Others were considerably more sparse. The variation itself tells you something. This wasn't a fixed legal procedure handed down from some central pirate authority. It was decided, ship by ship, crew by crew, by men who were choosing in that specific moment exactly how much mercy to extend to a shipmate they'd just voted to abandon. Why marooning and not simply execution? Here's the uncomfortable answer historians have settled on, piecing together motive from pattern. Marooning let the crew avoid the direct guilt of killing a man they'd sailed with, shared danger with, possibly liked, while still removing him from the ship and sending an unmistakable message to everyone who remained aboard. It also, in its way, honoured the spirit of the vote that ran through the entire pirate code. A marooned man wasn't murdered by his crewmates' hands. He was left to the sea, the sun, and his own resourcefulness. And whatever happened next was framed, however coldly, as fate rather than execution. Whether that distinction meant anything to the men actually left standing on the sand is a different question, and not one the record answers well. England's own case is unusually well documented compared to most marooning stories, precisely because he survived it, at least for a time, and because his prior fame meant later writers took an interest in what happened to him afterward. According to the accounts that circulated in the years following, England and 3 or 4 other officers marooned alongside him, accused of siding with him during the crew's vote, managed, after some period of hardship on Mauritius, to build a small boat crude enough to be almost suicidal and sail it to Madagascar, where a semi-organised pirate settlement offered the closest thing to sanctuary. A disgraced captain like England could still find. It's here the record grows genuinely uncertain, and worth flagging as such rather than stating flatly, Some versions have England living out his final years in reduced circumstances on Madagascar, reportedly reduced to begging for charity from pirates and traders who once would have deferred to him as a captain in his own right. A scale of fall from grace almost operatic in its irony. The specifics of his death, even the year, aren't nailed down with confidence. What is reasonably well supported, across multiple accounts, is the essential arc: a capable, comparatively humane captain, marooned by his own crew for the crime of extending mercy to an enemy, and reduced by the time of his final years to something far smaller than the man who once commanded 2 ships and 100 guns between them. Sit with that for a moment, because it's the detail that makes marooning more than just a gruesome footnote. The punishment wasn't reserved only for cowards, thieves, or men who broke faith with the crew in some obvious villainous way. England's crew marooned him for showing character, for choosing not to kill a defeated enemy, and the vote that condemned him was carried out under the exact same democratic machinery that, in other circumstances, historians point to as evidence of how remarkably fair pirate governance could be. The system that let 80 men vote a captain in could, with the same procedural legitimacy, vote him onto a beach to die. Fairness, it turns out, is not the same thing as kindness. A vote can be entirely legitimate and still be entirely merciless. Not every marooning story ends the way England's did, with a desperate escape and a slow decline elsewhere. Most marooned men, by the nature of the punishment, simply vanish from the record, left on some island whose exact location often wasn't recorded with any precision even by the crew that did the leaving, since precision wasn't really the point. We know marooning happened with some regularity because it appears again and again in the surviving sets of articles, as a specified penalty for specified crimes: desertion in the face of the enemy, concealing plunder from the common stock, bringing a woman aboard in violation of the code, cowardice that endangered the rest of the crew. We know it happened to real named individuals beyond England, referenced in passing in trial depositions and captains' logs, though the fullest accounts that survive tend to cluster around whichever cases happened to catch a chronicler's attention at the time, which means almost certainly the true number of men marooned across the whole of the Golden Age is considerably higher than the handful of stories that made it into any book. What made marooning function as deterrent, more than execution might have, was precisely its uncertainty. A hanging is quick, and however brutal, it's finished. Marooning stretched the sentence out across days, weeks, however long a man's water and nerve held. It let his own imagination do a portion of the punishment's work before thirst or exposure or a change of heart from a passing ship ever entered into it. Several accounts describe crews leaving a marooned man in view of a shipping lane on purpose, not entirely out of mercy, but because the slow possibility of rescue glimpsed sails on the horizon that might or might not stop, might or might not even see a man waving from the shore, was its own kind of torment, a hope cruel enough to be almost worse than none at all. There's a strange sideways kind of respect buried in the practice too, if you look at it from the angle historians studying pirate governance have increasingly taken. A crew that marooned rather than executed was, whether consciously or not, preserving the fiction, and in some cases the genuine reality, that the man being punished still had agency. He wasn't simply killed by decree, he was given tools, however minimal, and left to determine his own fate with them. It's the same instinct, oddly, that shows up in the compensation clauses we'll spend real time on later tonight, the ones that paid a man cash for a lost limb, rather than simply discarding him once he could no longer fight. Pirate justice, whatever else it was, kept circling back to this idea that a man's fate, even in punishment, should remain at least partly his own to determine. It's a small, cold comfort, and it did nothing at all for the men who never made it off whatever island they'd been left on. But it's there in the pattern, consistent enough across enough ships and enough decades that it can't simply be coincidence. Marooning's power over a pirate crew, though, extended well beyond the relatively rare instances when it was actually carried out. Its real influence lived in the threat of it, deployed constantly, almost casually, as a tool for keeping the men least invested in piracy. The forced hands, the pressed carpenters and surgeons and navigators taken unwillingly off captured merchant vessels, cooperative enough not to sabotage a voyage from within. Testimony given at several pirate trials in this period, including depositions taken from men captured alongside Roberts's crew, describes captains and quartermasters invoking the prospect of marooning almost offhandedly, a casual reminder dropped into ordinary shipboard conversation rather than a formal sentence pronounced with ceremony, fall out of line, and there's an island somewhere with your name on it. For a forced man weighing whether to attempt escape at the next port or quietly comply with orders he had no say in accepting, that threat did real work, arguably more real work in the aggregate than the actual marooning of any single individual, because it operated on every uncertain man aboard simultaneously, all the time, rather than on one condemned man after the fact. Fear, applied broadly and continuously, is a cheaper and more efficient instrument of control than punishment applied narrowly and occasionally, and there's no reason to think the pirates who ran these crews failed to understand that as well as any modern student of coercion would. It's worth naming, too, that marooning wasn't exclusively a punishment pirates inflicted on their own. Colonial authorities and naval captains occasionally marooned captured pirates themselves as an alternative to the expense and legal complication of a full trial, particularly in cases involving only a small number of prisoners taken from a minor vessel not worth the cost of transporting back to a proper court. The practice cut in both directions. In other words, another small piece of evidence for how thoroughly pirate custom and the custom of the legitimate maritime world it operated alongside borrowed from and echoed each other, however much both sides would have resisted the comparison if you'd suggested it to their faces. A punishment invented, refined, and codified aboard outlaw ships turns out to have been useful enough and cheap enough that the very authorities hunting those ships adopted a version of it themselves when the practical circumstances called for it. Edward England, for whatever it's worth, is remembered today less as a villain than as a cautionary figure, proof that even a pirate captain who tried to run his operation with something resembling honour could be destroyed by the very system of collective judgment that made pirate crews function at all. The vote that built the code also broke him. Both things are true, and the historical record, patchy and uncertain as it is in places, doesn't let you resolve the tension between them. It just leaves you standing on that beach in Mauritius with him, watching two ships shrink to nothing on the horizon, a bottle of water in your hand and the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be. Entirely up to you now. Not every man broke the code badly enough to earn an island. Most infractions aboard a pirate ship were smaller, more mundane, and dealt with faster, and it's in those smaller punishments, oddly, that you can see the code's machinery most clearly, grinding along day after day, watch after watch, whether anyone was watching a horizon for rescue ships or not. You're 4 months into your voyage aboard the Fortune's Revenge, and by now you understand something about shipboard discipline that no one back in Bristol ever explained to you. The sound comes first. Before you see anything, you hear the drum, a slow, deliberate beat that the ship's fiddler doubles as, since a pirate crew rarely carries a dedicated drummer, and everyone aboard has learned to recognise what that particular rhythm means. It means muster. It means the quartermaster has a sentence to carry out, and every man not actively required elsewhere is expected on deck to watch it happen. You've been aboard long enough now to know why. Punishment carried out in private teaches nothing to anyone but the man being punished. Punishment carried out on deck, in front of 80 witnesses, teaches the whole crew simultaneously. And that, more than cruelty for its own sake, is the actual logic behind why pirate discipline was almost always a public performance, rather than a quiet correction below decks. Today it's Hollis, the same gunner from your first month aboard, the one who nearly came to blows with Owen II over a card game. This time his offence is different, and by the standards of the code worse. He was found sleeping through part of his watch 3 nights back, during a stretch of open water where a merchant convoy might reasonably have been expected, and where a sleeping lookout could have cost the whole crew a prize, or worse. Let an enemy vessel close within gun range before anyone raised the alarm. The articles are specific here in ways they aren't always specific elsewhere. A man who endangers the ship through negligence answers for it publicly, and the standard sentence, absent some aggravating factor that would push it toward marooning, is Moses's law, 40 stripes lacking one, a number borrowed. As Barnaby explained to you weeks ago, straight out of Old Testament punishment codes, capped one short of the biblical 40 as a kind of built-in mercy against a court accidentally exceeding what Scripture itself allowed. Here's the thing that surprises you most. Watching your first flogging carried out under the code rather than simply hearing about one second-hand. It isn't chaos. The quartermaster, a broad, unhurried man named Josiah Vance in the account, passed down to us. Though like Barnaby, he's better understood as a composite of the role rather than a single documented individual, since so few quartermasters' names survive attached to specific floggings in the trial record, counts each stroke aloud, in a flat, almost bureaucratic voice. The same tone a clerk might use reading out a ledger. 1. The cat comes down. 2. A pause long enough for Hollis to draw breath before the next. This isn't cruelty performed for entertainment, it's punishment administered as procedure, exactly as unhurried, and exactly as documented as the compensation payout you watched Aldous the Carpenter receive back in month 2. Because in both cases the crew is watching to confirm the same thing, that the code is being followed to the letter, not exceeded, not shortened, not adjusted by anyone's personal feelings in the moment. 3 weeks later, a different kind of punishment plays out, one that has nothing to do with the lash and everything to do with humiliation as its own instrument. A young powder monkey, barely 14 by the look of him. A boy the crew calls Tam, taken aboard as an orphan volunteer out of a Charleston dockside rather than pressed like Barnaby was, is caught stealing double rations from the ship's stores, sneaking extra biscuit meant for the general pool. His offence doesn't rise to the level the articles reserve for marooning, since the amount taken is small and the crew, by informal consensus, regards a hungry boy stealing biscuit rather differently than they'd regard a grown man concealing a gold locket. Instead, Tam is sentenced to what several surviving accounts from the period, describing similar minor punishments, call sweating or running the gauntlet, made to run between two lines of his own crewmates, who strike at him with knotted rope ends, sail needles turned flat side out, or simply the flats of their hands as he passes, the severity calibrated, crew by crew, to the offence. It's humiliating rather than maiming, over in under a minute, and by the account we have of similar incidents, Tam comes out the other side with welts and wounded pride rather than any lasting injury. You notice something afterward that strikes you as strange. 2 of the older hands who struck him hardest during the run are the first to clap him on the shoulder once it's over, and one presses a spare biscuit into his hand that evening, unprompted. The punishment and the forgiveness, it seems, are meant to arrive close together, almost as if the crew understands that a code without some route back to belonging afterward would eventually break itself. By your 6th month aboard, you've come to understand something about the range of pirate punishment that the stories back in Bristol never captured. It wasn't a single blunt instrument. It was a graduated scale, running from public shaming through corporal punishment, through marooning, and finally to execution, with the severity calibrated, at least in principle, to the offence and its consequences for the crew as a whole. Keel-hauling, the practice, associated more with certain European naval traditions than with English-speaking pirates specifically, of dragging a man beneath the ship's hull on a rope, where barnacles could flay him alive and where drowning was a very live possibility, appears rarely if at all in the documented pirate articles that survive, which is worth noting precisely because popular imagination tends to assume it was common pirate practice. It wasn't, at least not by the evidence we actually have. Pirates, for all their reputation, generally preferred punishments that kept a man alive and functional afterward, useful for the next fight, the next prize, the next stretch of open ocean, practical calculation dressed up, when it needed to be, as mercy. Here's what makes the lash different from marooning in a way that matters for understanding the whole system. It was designed to be survivable, and more than that, it was designed to end with the punished man still fully a member of the crew, entitled to his vote, his share. his place at the next muster, the same as anyone else. A flogged man wasn't cast out. He was corrected, in the coldest possible sense of that word, and then folded straight back into the collective the code was built to hold together. Compare that, one more time, to a Royal Navy ship of the same era, where flogging could run to hundreds of lashes across multiple sessions for offences as minor as insolence to an officer, administered by a captain with no obligation to justify the number to anyone above him, and no vote of any kind involved at any stage. The pirate lash, by contrast, was capped, counted publicly, tied to a specific written offence the whole crew had agreed to in advance, and finished definitively once the count was reached. It's a low bar to clear, and clearing it doesn't make pirate discipline gentle, but it does make it something closer to law than to whim, and that distinction, small as it sounds, was the entire point of writing the articles down in the first place. You notice, by this point in the voyage, that the ship's surgeon stands at every flogging, positioned close enough to intervene, and it takes you a while to understand why a man dedicated to healing would place himself at the centre of the crew's harshest ritual rather than as far from it as duty allowed. The surgeon aboard the Fortune's Revenge, a taciturn, once forced man named Elias Pruitt, who came aboard the same way Barnaby did, taken off a captured vessel for his particular skill, has, according to Barnaby, halted a flogging outright on at least one occasion earlier in the ship's history, stepping forward mid-sentence to tell the quartermaster that the man receiving punishment couldn't survive the remaining count without serious risk of death, and that the sentence, agreed to as 40 stripes, would have to be suspended and finished on a later day once the man's body could bear it. The quartermaster, by Barnaby's account, didn't argue. The surgeon's medical judgment carried its own kind of authority under the code, a check on punishment separate from and running alongside the procedural fairness of the counted lash itself. One more small piece of evidence that the men who built this system understood, at some level, that a punishment carried out to the letter of the law could still, without careful oversight, tip over into something closer to execution by another name. You find yourself watching Pruitt now, every time the drum sounds for muster, less because you doubt the quartermaster's count than because you've come to understand that his presence there is itself part of what makes the count trustworthy in the first place. 8 months out, deep into the voyage now, you witness the harshest end of the corporal scale, a punishment reserved for an offence the articles treat almost as seriously as marooning itself, striking an officer. A young sailor named Price, drunk on captured Madeira wine well past the 8 o'clock candle curfew, takes a swing at the boatswain during an argument over a missed watch assignment. Striking a fellow crewman is already an offence under the code, settled ashore by sword and pistol as you learned back in month 1. But striking an officer, someone charged with a specific responsibility for the ship's discipline and safety, carries heavier weight, and the quartermaster's judgment this time is harsher than Hollis's 40 stripes, 50 lashes, delivered over 2 separate musters 2 days apart. To keep the punishment from crossing into something closer to a death sentence, delivered through cruelty rather than correction. You watch Price afterward, back raw, moving stiffly for a week, unable to take a full watch rotation until he heals. Nobody shuns him for it once his sentence is served. The debt, as far as the crew is concerned, has been paid in full, in exactly the currency the article specified, and that, more than anything else you've learned this voyage, might be the actual heart of pirate justice. Not mercy, not cruelty, but the strange, cold comfort of knowing precisely what a given offence will cost you, before you ever commit it. Somewhere around your 9th month aboard, a rumour starts circulating among the newer hands, the kind of rumour that always seems to travel faster below decks than any order from the quartermaster ever does, that the punishment awaiting the truly unforgivable offence, the one worse than marooning, worse than the noose, is a walk off a plank suspended over open water, blindfolded, at sword point. You've heard the phrase before, whispered in taverns back in Bristol as the very picture of pirate cruelty. Barnaby laughs when you ask him about it, not unkindly, and tells you something that surprises you. In all his years at sea, across 3 different crews and countless captured prizes, he's never once seen it happen, and neither, as far as he knows, has anyone else still living to talk about it. The plank, it turns out, belongs almost entirely to a later century's imagination, a vivid theatrical image that took root in 19th century adventure fiction and stage plays long after the Golden Age itself had ended, and which then got projected backward onto pirates who never actually practiced it in any form the surviving trial records or ships articles describe. Real pirate executions, when they happened at all aboard ship rather than at the hands of a colonial court, tended toward methods considerably less theatrical and considerably more final, hanging from the yardarm, a pistol shot, or simply being put over the side without ceremony, the body left to the sea rather than made to walk toward it. The plank, elaborate and cruelly patient by comparison, would have cost a crew time, attention, and a length of good timber they likely needed for something more practical. It's a small myth to puncture, but it matters, because it's a reminder that the actual documented punishments, the lash, the marooning, the compensation ledger, are strange and grim enough on their own without needing an invented flourish to make the history feel dramatic. The truth rarely needed the embellishment. It was already unsettling as written. What did occasionally happen, and what the record supports with rather more confidence, was branding, not as a punishment specified in most surviving articles, but as a mark some captains applied to a man caught in a second, repeated offence of theft from the common stock, burned into the hand or the thumb with a hot iron in a practice borrowed directly from English criminal law of the period, where branding a convicted thief's thumb was a standard, unremarkable sentence handed down in ordinary courts back on land. A pirate crew adopting the same practice wasn't inventing new cruelty. It was importing a punishment every one of these men would have recognised from the world they'd left behind, applying to a repeat offender the exact mark that would have followed him through any encounter with English law for the rest of his life anyway. You never witness a branding yourself over the course of your voyage. By your account, and Barnaby's both, it was already becoming a rarer practice by the 1720s, gradually crowded out by the more standardised lash and marooning framework the written articles increasingly favoured. But knowing it existed, even at the margins, rounds out the picture of a punishment system that borrowed as freely from the legal customs of the shore as it did from anything invented fresh aboard ship. Piracy, for all its outlaw reputation, rarely broke entirely with the world it had turned against. It borrowed from that world constantly, reshaping familiar punishments to fit a crew that had, in every other respect, written its own law. 10 months out of Nassau, with the voyage nearing whatever ending it's going to have, you find yourself standing muster for what turns out to be the last flogging of the trip. Not your own, but Barnaby's, oddly enough. The cooper who first explained the code to you back in the first week, and who you'd have sworn was the last man aboard likely to break it. His offence is almost sympathetic in its smallness, caught rationing water more generously to a sick crewman than the officially allotted share during a stretch of becalmed weather when supplies were running thin for everyone. Technically, this is theft from the common stock, the same category of offence that could, under a stricter reading, have sent Croft to an island back in month 2. But the quartermaster, weighing the circumstances, a sick man, a small quantity, no personal gain to Barnaby himself, settles on a lighter sentence, 15 lashes rather than 40, a judgment call that reminds you, watching it happen, that even a written code still runs through human hands, capable of nuance the letter of the law doesn't always capture on its own. Barnaby takes his 15 without complaint, and 3 days later he's back at his casks, and the sick crewman he'd shared water with recovers well enough to stand his own watch again within the fortnight. Whatever the code cost him, it seems, in Barnaby's own accounting, to have been worth paying. Barnaby's water ration wasn't the only debt the code kept careful track of that voyage. There was another kind of ledger running alongside the one for punishments, a ledger for what the crew owed a man, not for what he owed the crew, and it's here that pirate law starts to look less like brutality and more like something closer to an insurance policy, written up 2 centuries before the word existed. Aboard a nameless sloop off the Leeward Islands sometime in the early 1720s, a boarding action goes wrong in the specific, unglamorous way that most injuries at sea actually happened, not in some dramatic clash of cutlasses under a black flag, but in the chaos of grappling hooks, splintering wood, and men scrambling across a gap of open water between two hulls that refused to stay still. A pirate whose name hasn't survived in any account we have, one of the countless anonymous men who make up the actual bulk of the historical record, remembered only in the shape of what happened to them rather than in any name attached to it, takes a musket ball through the meat of his right arm during the boarding, and by the time the ship's makeshift surgeon gets to him, infection has already set in deep enough that amputation is the only option that offers any real chance of survival. The arm comes off above the elbow, by saw, with nothing for the pain beyond rum, and a leather strap between the man's teeth. The standard field surgery of the era, whether you served under the king's colours or under no colours at all. What happens next is the part that separates his story from what would have happened to almost any wounded sailor serving anywhere else in the 18th century world. Under Bartholomew Roberts' articles, as preserved in Johnson's account and echoed with only minor variation in other surviving sets from ships like John Phillips's Revenge, the loss of a limb or the reduction to a cripple in the ship's service entitled a man to 800 pieces of eight paid out of the ship's public stock, before any general division of plunder took place among the rest of the crew. Lesser injuries were compensated on a sliding scale beneath that figure, a lost eye or a lost finger valued at a proportionally smaller sum, the exact numbers varying somewhat from ship to ship, but following the same basic logic throughout. 800 pieces of eight, to put a number on what that actually meant in the world these men lived in, was a sum that could, by some period estimates, represent multiple years of an ordinary sailor's wages in merchant or naval service, a life-changing amount of money, paid out not as charity, not at the whim of a captain's mood that particular week, but as a contractual entitlement written into the same document that governed every other aspect of shipboard law. This is the story of the Compensation Code, the clause tucked near the bottom of nearly every set of pirate articles that survives. Easy to overlook next to the more dramatic language about death and marooning, but arguably the clearest evidence historians have that the men who wrote these documents were thinking, with real seriousness, about what it actually cost a crew when one of its members was permanently changed by the violence they all knew they'd signed up for. Compare it, because the comparison is where the real weight of this chapter lives, to what a wounded sailor could expect from the legitimate maritime world of the same decade. The Royal Navy maintained something called the Chatham Chest, a fund established as far back as the 1590s under Elizabeth I, into which sailors' wages were docked a small mandatory contribution specifically to provide for men disabled in the King's service. In principle, it sounds similar to the Pirate Compensation Clause, a collective fund, paid into by the crew, drawn from by the injured. In practice, by the early 1700s, the Chatham Chest had become notorious for corruption, delay, and outright fraud among the officials who administered it, with wounded sailors frequently waiting years for payments that, when they finally arrived, amounted to a fraction of what Roberts's articles promised outright and paid, by most accounts, considerably faster. Greenwich Hospital, established later in the same period to house and support disabled naval veterans directly, offered shelter and modest provision rather than a lump cash sum a man could use however he saw fit. Useful, certainly, but a very different kind of security than 800 pieces of eight handed over on the spot, out of a stock the man himself had helped fill. The economist Peter Leeson, writing an academic analysis of pirate governance in the years following his initial research on the subject, argued that this wasn't sentiment on the pirates' part, or not merely sentiment. It was rational institutional design, the same kind of reasoning a modern insurance company or a workers' compensation board would recognise immediately, dressed up in 18th century language and enforced by armed men rather than by courts. A pirate crew depended, more than almost any other kind of organisation of the era, on every man aboard being willing to fight hard, board first, take real risks in a boarding action, where the difference between a captured prize and a bloody failure might come down to who hesitated and who didn't. A man who feared that losing a limb meant losing everything: his livelihood, his place among his shipmates, his ability to provide for himself ever again, was a man who would hesitate at exactly the wrong moment. Guarantee him, in writing before the fight ever started, that his crewmates would make him financially whole regardless of what the fight cost him physically, and you remove a significant source of that hesitation. The compensation clause wasn't kindness dressed up as policy. It was policy that happened, as a side effect, to look a great deal like kindness. The public stock that funded all of this, worth pausing on for a moment, wasn't some abstract treasury conjured from nowhere. It was built, prize by prize, from a portion set aside before any general division took place, meaning every man aboard was in effect paying into his own eventual insurance policy with every voyage he sailed, whether he ever collected on it or not. This is precisely the structure Peter Leeson's later economic analysis would seize on as evidence that pirate compensation wasn't charity dressed up as policy. It was policy, full stop, funded the way any collective insurance scheme is funded, by the contributions of the many covering the eventual claims of the unlucky few. Disputes over the fund weren't unheard of. Trial testimony from several captured pirate crews describes arguments, sometimes heated, over whether a given injury genuinely qualified under the article's terms, a man claiming a wound sustained defending the ship against a claim from others that he'd been careless, drunk, or simply unlucky in a moment that had nothing to do with combat at all, since the articles, on most ships. Distinguished between injuries sustained in the service and injuries a man brought on himself. Adjudicating that distinction fell again to the quartermaster, whose judgment in these cases carried real financial weight for the man in question and real cost to the collective stock everyone else aboard had a stake in protecting. It wasn't always a comfortable position to occupy, weighing one shipmate suffering against another's suspicion that the claim wasn't quite honest. But it's one more piece of evidence that the compensation code, however remarkable its headline generosity looks against the Chatham Chest or Greenwich Hospital, still had to function as a real, contested, occasionally fraught system administered by fallible men rather than an automatic machine that simply paid out whenever asked. None of which is to say the system was generous in every direction, or that it treated every kind of harm with the same careful arithmetic. The articles are notably silent across every surviving version historians have studied. On compensation for psychological injury of any kind, no clause anywhere addresses the men who came home from a voyage unable to sleep, unable to stop flinching at loud noises, changed in ways no amount of pieces of 8 could touch. Because the 18th century, aboard a pirate ship or anywhere else, had no vocabulary yet for that kind of wound. The compensation code understood loss only in terms it could count, measure, and pay out in coin. And there is something genuinely sad, alongside everything else, in how carefully these men built a system to address the harms they could see and priced in, while leaving entirely unaddressed the harms that left no visible mark on a man's body at all. There's also a darker undertone worth being honest about rather than smoothing over, because a full account of the compensation code has to include it. Some surviving versions of pirate articles, including certain copies of the articles attributed to crews operating in this period, specified compensation not only in coin, but in a handful of documented instances, in enslaved people. Valuing a man's lost limb in terms of ownership over other human beings rather than money alone. A detail that should stop any modern listener cold, and that historians studying these documents have not shied away from noting plainly. It's a reminder that the same men capable of building a genuinely progressive system of collective insurance for their own injured were, in the same era, embedded in and often actively participating in the broader Atlantic economy of human trafficking that surrounded them on every side, from the merchant ships they raided to the colonial ports where they occasionally sold their plunder. Pirate governance doesn't fit neatly into either the romantic story of noble outlaws or the simple story of irredeemable villains. It was both progressive and monstrous, sometimes within the very same clause of the very same document, and the honest version of this history has to hold both of those facts at once, rather than choosing the more comfortable one. the sliding scale beneath the headline figure of 800 pieces of 8 is worth walking through in its own right, because the specificity of it is what makes the whole clause feel less like a vague promise and more like an actuarial table drawn up by men who had clearly thought hard in advance about every way a body could be broken in their line of work. The loss of a right arm in several surviving versions of the articles is valued distinctly from the loss of a left, a distinction that reflects the practical reality that a right-handed man's dominant arm carried more earning potential as a sailor, a tradesman, a fighter than his offhand, and the code priced that difference in coin without apparent embarrassment about doing so. A lost eye carried its own set figure, smaller than a limb but still substantial, alongside a specific injury category surviving accounts described simply as the loss of the sight in one eye, treated separately from the eye's physical removal, since a man could be blinded by a wound without losing the eye itself, and the code, remarkably, seems to have anticipated that distinction too. Lost fingers were valued individually rather than as a lump category, a detail that becomes almost unbearably specific once you sit with it. Some clerk, some quartermaster, some collective vote among a crew of hardened men had at some point sat down and worked out, finger by finger, precisely what each digit was worth to a sailor's future livelihood, whether he needed it for handling rope, for gripping a blade, for the 100 small tasks a hand without all its parts would suddenly find difficult. What emerges from that level of granular detail isn't sentimentality, exactly, but something adjacent to it, a system built by men who understood, with an intimacy no naval bureaucrat drafting the Chatham Chest regulations back in London could have matched, exactly what each specific wound would cost a working sailor for the rest of his life. They'd seen it happen to shipmates. Some of them undoubtedly were pricing out injuries they privately feared might be their own turn next. There's a kind of dark camaraderie buried in that arithmetic, a crew essentially insuring each other against a shared and near certain risk, spreading the cost of any one man's bad luck across the collective stock everyone had a hand in filling. It doesn't erase the violence that made the compensation necessary in the first place, but it does complicate, usefully, any simple story about pirates as men who cared for nothing beyond their own immediate share of the plunder. The evidence, laid out clause by clause, finger by finger, suggests otherwise. Set that against the smaller, quieter details that survive about how compensation actually played out for individual men, and the picture gets more complicated still, in the way real history usually does, rather than resolving into something simple. There are accounts, scattered through trial records and depositions from captured pirates describing their former ship's customs to the authorities interrogating them, of injured men receiving their compensation and choosing, of their own accord, to remain aboard in a reduced capacity rather than take their payout and leave, a wounded gunner turned ship's cook. A man missing 2 fingers reassigned to less physically demanding duties, kept aboard not out of charity exactly, but because his knowledge and his continued willingness to serve were valued by a crew that had, in a real sense, already paid what it owed him, and considered the debt settled rather than the relationship ended. It's a small detail, easy to miss among the larger, more dramatic punishments this whole night has walked through, but it might be the single clearest window into what made a pirate crew function as something more than a collection of armed strangers temporarily inconvenienced by having to share a ship. A community, however transient, however built on violence and coercion in equal measure, that had worked out, in writing exactly what it owed its own wounded, and then, in enough documented cases to matter, actually paid it. Money and limbs weren't the only things the code kept a running account of. Underneath the big dramatic punishments, the lash, the marooning, the death sentence, sat a whole layer of smaller rules governing the ordinary texture of shipboard life, and it's worth spending real time down there, because it's often in the small rules that you learn the most about what a crew actually feared. You're well past the halfway point of your voyage now, 10 months aboard the Fortune's Revenge, and you've started to notice that the articles you signed back in Nassau Harbour cover far more ground than the handful of dramatic clauses everyone talks about first. Take the rule about musicians. buried near the middle of your ship's articles, in language nobody expected to find funny when it was first read aloud to you, is a clause specifying that the ship's fiddler and drummer are entitled to rest on the Sabbath day, exempt from having to perform for the crew's entertainment on the one day of the week most sailors, pirate or otherwise, still treated as at least nominally set apart. It's a small provision, almost sweet in its specificity, evidence that the men drafting these documents were thinking not just about violence and money, but about something as mundane as whether the two exhausted men responsible for keeping morale up through nightly music deserved one day off in 7. You'd laugh about it more, except you've come to understand, 10 months in, that nothing in this document made it onto the page by accident. If the musician's rest clause exists, it's because at some point, on some ship, somebody didn't get a day off, and the crew that wrote these particular articles decided that wouldn't happen again under their watch. The fire safety rules matter more urgently, and you learn why the hard way 3 weeks into a stretch of calm weather, when a young sailor named Griggs is caught smoking a pipe below decks near the powder store, well after the candle curfew and in direct violation of the specific clause governing open flame near the ship's magazine. Griggs isn't a bad man, by any account you've heard, careless, maybe, tired after a long watch, craving tobacco enough to forget for one dangerous minute exactly what he was standing next to. But the quartermaster's response is swift, and by the standards you've come to expect, almost disproportionately harsh for what looks, on its face, like a minor lapse. Griggs draws 20 stripes, less than Hollis got for sleeping through his watch, but delivered with an unmistakable edge of real anger from the men administering it. Because everyone aboard understands, in a way that needs no further explanation, exactly what a spark near the magazine could do to all 80 of them at once. Some rules on this ship exist to punish harm already done. This one exists to punish the mere possibility of harm, and the crew treats that possibility as seriously as if it had already happened. Not every rule aboard the Fortune's Revenge made it onto the written page at all, and by your 11th month you've come to recognise the unwritten customs almost as clearly as the 11 signed clauses, even though breaking one carries no formal punishment the quartermaster would ever record. No whistling on deck, for one, an old sailor's superstition. Common across pirate and merchant ships alike, holding that whistling invited a storm the ship didn't need and couldn't necessarily survive, and while nobody's ever flogged for it in your hearing, a man who whistles carelessly within earshot of the older hands gets a look sharp enough to make the point without a single word spoken. No renaming a ship once she's been christened, another superstition carried over wholesale from merchant custom, treated as bad luck serious enough that even a captured prize sailed onward as a new addition to the fleet typically keeps some echo of her original name rather than being rebaptized outright. And no bringing a black seabird aboard, dead or alive, a superstition tangled up with old sailors' beliefs about the souls of drowned men returning in feathered form to warn the living. A belief you'd have laughed at back in Bristol, and one you no longer laugh at quite so easily. 10 months into a life where the difference between a calm crossing and a fatal storm sometimes really does seem to turn on nothing more than luck nobody aboard can fully explain. These unwritten rules carry no lash, no marooning, no formal sentence of any kind, but they bind the crew together in their own quiet way, alongside the 11 clauses everyone signed, proof that not every rule holding 80 desperate men together needed a quartermaster's counted stripes to enforce it. Some rules simply survive because everyone aboard has, in their own private way, decided they're not willing to risk finding out what happens if they don't. There's a rule governing something as small as a single gunshot that teaches you, in the 11th month, just how seriously this crew treats the idea of unnecessary risk. The articles carried by many pirate ships of the era, including versions attributed to captains operating in these same waters, forbid the snapping of a firearm below decks. Discharging a pistol for any reason short of genuine emergency, in the cramped, poorly lit spaces where a stray shot could ricochet off a bulkhead and kill a man as easily as any enemy's musket ball, or worse, find its way into a powder cask and take the whole deck with it. You watch the rule enforced firsthand when a young sailor named Coombs showing off after a good haul of captured rum, fires his pistol into the air on deck rather than below decks, technically outside the letter of the clause since he's not below at the time, but close enough to the spirit of it that the quartermaster hauls him up regardless, reasoning aloud, for the benefit of everyone within earshot, that a rule meaning to prevent accidental death shouldn't need a lawyer's precision to interpret correctly. Coombs draws 10 lashes, light by the standards you've seen applied to worse offences, but enough to make the point land. Weapons on this ship exist for one purpose, and celebration isn't it. The same instinct governs a related but distinct rule you learn about only second-hand, since nobody aboard the Fortune's Revenge actually breaks it during your time aboard. The prohibition, carried in several sets of articles, against striking a man with intent to kill rather than merely to injure during an authorised duel ashore. Recall the sanctioned combat you learnt about back in your first weeks, the sword and pistol duels the code permitted, as a release valve for grievances that couldn't be settled any other way. Even that sanctioned violence had limits. Several surviving accounts describe duels stopped short of death by mutual agreement or by witnesses intervening once first blood was drawn, the understanding being that the code wanted disputes settled, not crew members eliminated outright, since a dead shipmate was a lost hand at the braces and a lost vote at the next muster, whatever the depths of the original quarrel. A crew this size, this far from resupply, this dependent on every able body pulling its weight, simply couldn't afford to let personal grudges thin its own ranks past the point the ship could function. Even violence, on this ship, was budgeted. Then there's the rule you've heard whispered about since your first week aboard, but never actually seen tested. Until now, the prohibition on bringing a woman or a disguised boy aboard the ship without the whole crew's consent, a clause carried in one form or another in Bartholomew Roberts's articles, and echoed across several other surviving sets from the era, punishable in the starkest possible terms, by death. It sounds, on the surface, like simple 18th century prejudice dressed up in legal language, and there's certainly an element of that running through it. Most pirate crews, like most sailing communities of the period, held deep superstitions about women aboard ship bringing bad luck, disrupting discipline, sparking exactly the kind of jealous violence among the crew that the articles were otherwise designed to prevent. But there's also a more practical logic tangled up in the same clause, one that has less to do with superstition than with the same problem the fire safety rule addresses. 80 armed, exhausted men living in close quarters for months at a stretch represented a volatile enough situation without adding a source of potential rivalry and resentment that the code had no other mechanism to manage. The death penalty attached to the clause was, by most accounts, rarely if ever actually carried out in its full severity. Historians note that enforcement varied enormously, and that the harshest written penalty didn't always match the harshest applied one, but its mere presence on the page tells you how seriously the men who wrote these articles took the threat of disorder it was meant to prevent. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the single most famous violation of this exact clause in the entire historical record didn't end in anyone's execution at all. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the two women who served, disguised for periods as men, aboard Calico Jack Rackham's sloop in the early 1720s, are among the best documented pirates of the entire Golden Age, precisely because their identities were eventually discovered, and because both stood trial in Jamaica in 1720 alongside the rest of Rackham's crew, a trial whose records survive in far more detail than most, since the novelty of two women pirates guaranteed contemporary interest that a routine trial of male sailors rarely attracted. Both were convicted, and both remarkably escaped hanging by successfully pleading pregnancy, a defence English law recognised at the time, and one the court had no real choice but to honour, at least temporarily, regardless of how the judges may have felt about the irony of it. What happened to each of them afterward is murkier than the trial itself. Read is generally believed to have died in prison of a fever not long after, while Bonny's fate afterward is genuinely uncertain, with no reliable record of what became of her, leaving the door open to a great deal of romantic speculation that the actual documentation simply doesn't support one way or the other. Their case matters for tonight's purposes not because it proves the women aboard clause was toothless. Plenty of ships enforced it rigorously, and being discovered could carry consequences even short of formal execution, from marooning to simple expulsion at the next port, but because it shows how unevenly even the most severely worded clauses in the pirate code were actually applied. Depending entirely on the specific crew, the specific captain, and how the specific individuals involved had earned the loyalty or suspicion of the men around them. Desertion carries its own weight in the articles, distinct from the cowardice in battle clause you learnt about back in month 1. A man who simply slips away at a port of call, taking his share of accumulated plunder without formally settling his account with the crew or giving proper notice of his intent to leave the company, is treated, under most versions of the code, as having effectively stolen from the common stock, subject to the same range of penalties as concealment, up to and including marooning if he's ever caught again by the same crew or one of its allies. You watch this play out in the 7th month at a port stop in the Leeward Islands, when a young sailor named Perkins fails to return to the ship by the agreed hour, and word later reaches the crew, through a tavern keeper who owed the quartermaster a favour, that Perkins had been overheard planning to slip away entirely, taking a share he hadn't formally settled. The ship sails without him. There's no time to hunt a man down in a crowded port without risking the whole crew's exposure to the authorities. But the quartermaster makes a point of announcing, publicly, that Perkins's name and description will be shared with allied crews at the next pirate haven the ship visits, a kind of informal blacklist that functioned. Across the loose network of Golden Age pirate ships, almost like a credit rating in reverse. A man who broke faith with one crew often found it considerably harder to sign articles with the next. The quietest, but in some ways most severe clause you encounter all voyage concerns conspiracy, not an act of violence or theft, but the mere planning of one. Any man discovered plotting against the captain or quartermaster in secret, rather than raising a grievance openly through the vote the way the code intended, faces the harshest end of the punishment scale available, up to and including execution, because a code built entirely on the premise of open collective decision-making has almost no tolerance for anything that undermines that openness from the shadows. You never witnessed this one carried out yourself, but Barnaby tells you, in a low voice one evening near the end of the voyage, about a crew he sailed with 2 years earlier, where 2 men were caught passing whispered plans to seize the ship's stores and abandon the rest of the crew at the next port, keeping the plunder for themselves rather than dividing it according to the articles. Both men, according to Barnaby, were marooned together on a small quay off the Bahamas, given slightly less water than the standard allotment as an explicit mark of the crew's particular anger at betrayal from within rather than mere rule-breaking from without. Whether the 2 of them survived, Barnaby never learned, and neither will you. Some threads in this story simply end without resolution, which is, in its own way, as honest a note as any other about what actually happened to most of the men who lived and died under articles like these. Tam, the young powder monkey you watched run the gauntlet for stealing biscuit back in month 4, resurfaces one more time before the voyage's end, and his second appearance carries far more weight than his first. During the boarding action that takes the richest prize of the whole voyage, Tam, barely older now than he was when he took his punishment, though something in the way he carries himself has changed in the months between, is struck across the forearm by a defender's cutlass, a wound serious enough to require the ship's rough and ready surgeon to close it with a dozen stitches, but not serious, enough to cost him the arm outright. Under the articles, a wound of this severity, short of full loss of a limb, still carries its own smaller compensation figure, and you watch the quartermaster count out Tam's share of the injury payment with the same careful, unhurried procedure you've seen applied to every other article of the code, all voyage. The same procedure that once counted out his punishment now counting out what the crew owes him for what the fight cost him. Barnaby, standing beside you, nods toward the boy as the coins change hands. "Same document," he says quietly, "different page." It's a small moment, easy to miss amid the general business of dividing a rich prize, but it might be the clearest single illustration the whole voyage offers of what the code actually was, underneath every clause and every punishment, not cruelty, not kindness, but a promise, kept with remarkable consistency in both directions, to the same boy across the same months, from the humiliation of the gauntlet to the quiet dignity of a debt paid in full. By the time your voyage nears its end, you've come to see the code the way Barnaby always seemed to see it, not as a single towering law hanging over the ship, but as a whole ecosystem of smaller rules, each one addressing a specific fear the crew had learned, sometimes at terrible cost, to take seriously. The musician's rest clause protects morale. The fire safety clause protects the ship itself. The women aboard clause, whatever its uglier undercurrents, tries to protect the fragile discipline holding 80 desperate men together. The desertion and conspiracy clauses protect the trust that makes any of the rest of it possible. None of these rules, on their own, look like much. Together, they add up to something that starts to resemble, if you squint at it in the right light. An actual functioning legal system, cruder than anything back home, built by outlaws for outlaws, but a system nonetheless, and one that for all its brutality kept your ship from tearing itself apart from the inside for the better part of a year at sea. Every punishment we've walked through so far tonight, the lash, the marooning, the careful arithmetic of a missing limb, was administered by pirates, on pirates, according to a code pirates themselves had written and signed. What happened next in this story was different in kind, not just in scale. It was the moment the code these men had trusted for years met a court that had never recognised its legitimacy for a single day and had no intention of starting now. The morning of February 10th, 1722, finds the Royal Fortune anchored off Cape Lopez, on the coast of what is now Gabon, her crew nursing the after-effects of a night of hard drinking to celebrate a recent prize. When a lookout spots sails on the horizon that turn out, within the hour, to belong to Hump's Swallow, a 50-gun Royal Navy warship under Captain Chaloner Ogle, sent specifically to hunt down the most successful pirate captain of the age. Bartholomew Roberts, the same man whose articles opened our story tonight, comes on deck dressed, according to the account preserved by Johnson, in a crimson waistcoat and a hat with a red feather, as flamboyant in his final engagement as the legend that had grown up around him over 4 years and hundreds of captured ships. A single burst of grapeshot from the Swallow's opening broadside catches him in the throat. He dies within minutes, and in accordance with what several accounts describe as his own standing wish never to be taken alive by the authorities, his crew weights his body and puts it over the side before the battle is even fully decided, denying Ogle the trophy of the corpse itself, though not, as it turns out, the far larger prize still aboard the ship. What Ogle takes instead, once the Royal Fortune and her companion vessels are subdued, is somewhere in the region of 270 men, the largest single capture of pirates in the entire Golden Age, a haul so large that the ordinary machinery of English justice, built around shipping prisoners back to London for trial at the Old Bailey, simply couldn't accommodate it. A recent piece of legislation, the Piracy Act of 1721, had specifically anticipated this kind of problem, granting colonial authorities the power to try suspected pirates locally, on the spot, rather than enduring the months-long delay and expense of transporting hundreds of prisoners across the Atlantic. Ogle sails his captives to Cape Coast Castle, a fortified slave trading post on the Gold Coast, operated by the Royal African Company, and it's here, in the last days of March and the early weeks of April 1722, that the largest pirate trial in recorded history takes place. This is the story of that trial, not a punishment carried out under the pirate's own code, but the code's final, brutal confrontation with a system of justice that had written the men standing before it out of its protection before the proceedings even began. The court that convenes at Cape Coast Castle is a special commission, made up of naval officers and colonial officials rather than professional judges, operating under wartime-adjacent authority that gave it considerably more latitude, and considerably less procedural patience than an ordinary English criminal court back home would have allowed. The surviving published record of the proceedings, printed in London the following year under the title a full and exact account of the trial of all the pirates. A document historians treat as broadly reliable precisely because it was an official record intended for a legal and political audience rather than a piece of popular entertainment like Johnson's later book. Describes prisoners brought forward in groups, questioned about their role aboard Roberts's ships, and asked again and again to answer the single question that would determine whether they lived or died, had they joined willingly, or had they been forced. It's here that the Pirate Code's own language comes back, ironically, to save some of the men it once bound. Roberts's articles, remember, specified that a man taken off a captured vessel because the crew needed his particular skill could be pressed into service against his will. And crucially, several surviving accounts of pirate custom note that forced men were sometimes deliberately kept from receiving a full share of plunder or from signing the articles themselves. A practice some captains maintained specifically, so that if the ship were ever taken, those men would have a clearer legal argument that they'd never truly joined the company. Whether that practice reflected genuine mercy on the part of captains anticipating this exact moment, or simply cold calculation about which men were worth the risk of full initiation, the record doesn't say for certain. But at Cape Coast Castle, it mattered enormously. A carpenter named Harry Glasby, who had served as one of Roberts's own officers, argued that he had attempted to desert the crew on more than one occasion and had been prevented by force each time, testimony corroborated, remarkably, by several other prisoners willing to speak in his defence even as their own fates hung in the balance. Glasby was acquitted. Other men, unable to produce similar corroboration or found to have taken an active hand in violence against captured merchant crews, were not so fortunate. Some of the condemned men, once hanged, weren't simply cut down and buried, and it's worth understanding why in a way that connects the punishment English law inflicted on pirates back to the punishments we've spent the whole night watching pirates inflict on each other. A number of executed pirates across the Golden Age, including several from crews captured in these same years, were gibbeted after death, their bodies coated in tar to slow decomposition, bound in an iron cage or frame, and displayed publicly at prominent locations, often at the mouth of a harbour or a river where incoming sailors would be certain to see them, sometimes for months or even years afterward. The practice wasn't unique to pirates. English law used gibbeting for a range of serious crimes throughout this period. But for pirates specifically, hanged at ports that depended on shipping and sailors passing through, the message carried an unmistakable, almost surgical precision. Every man arriving by sea would see, before he ever set foot on land, exactly what this particular choice of career could cost him. It's the same logic, cousin to the same instinct, that put Hollis's 40 stripes on public display back aboard the Fortune's Revenge rather than administering them quietly below decks. Punishment as a lesson broadcast to the living, not merely a debt collected from the guilty. The pirates' own code understood this instinct well enough to build it into their everyday discipline. The English court that hanged their crews at Cape Coast Castle understood it too, and applied it with a permanence and a public patience no pirate ship's muster ever needed to match. When the verdicts are finally rendered, the numbers tell a story blunter than any single testimony could. Approximately 52 men are sentenced to death and hanged, most of them in batches over the course of several days at Cape Coast Castle itself, their bodies in a number of cases left displayed afterward as a deterrent to any sailor who might otherwise consider a similar life. A practice English authorities used consistently throughout this era specifically because a hidden execution taught no one anything, the exact same logic turned to a far darker purpose that governed the pirates' own public floggings back aboard ship. Around 20 more men are sentenced not to death but to 7 years of indentured servitude, working off their sentences directly for the Royal African Company that operated the very fort where they stood trial. Men who had spent years capturing and plundering merchant vessels now bound, by court order, to labour for one of the largest commercial slave trading operations in the Atlantic world. A sentence that carried its own grim irony, given how many of Roberts's captured ships had themselves been slaving vessels seized in the course of ordinary piracy. A smaller number, perhaps a couple of dozen, are shipped onward to England to face further proceedings at the Marshalsea prison in London, their cases judged too complicated or too politically significant to resolve locally, and a substantial remaining group, somewhere in the range of 70 or more men, are acquitted outright, the court accepting in each individual case that the evidence supported a claim of having been forced into service against their will. But the numbers above don't capture the full and darkest dimension of what happened at that trial, and it's a detail that has to be said plainly rather than smoothed over, because leaving it out would misrepresent the actual historical record in a way this whole night has tried hard to avoid. Among the roughly 270 men Ogle brought to Cape Coast Castle, a significant number, historians estimate somewhere in the range of 60 to 70, were black Africans who had served aboard Roberts's ships, some as free crew members who had joined the pirate company on the same terms as anyone else, entitled under the Articles to the same vote, the same share, the same protections every other man aboard could claim. The court did not try most of these men as pirates at all. Under the legal framework of the period, and under direct pressure from the Royal African Company that operated the fort where the trial took place, the great majority of these black crew members were simply reclassified as property and reabsorbed into the slave trade the company existed to run, denied even the grim due process, however compromised, however weighted against them from the start, that their white shipmates received. Whatever equality some of them may have experienced under Roberts's Articles, sharing a vote and a portion of plunder with men who'd have owned them anywhere else in the Atlantic world of 1722, ended the moment the Swallow's guns opened fire. The Pirate Code, whatever fairness historians have found worth noting in it, could not protect the men it claimed to protect once that code no longer had a ship, a captain or a crew standing behind it to enforce its own terms. It's worth sitting with that fact for a moment rather than rushing past it towards some more comfortable resolution, because it's the clearest illustration this entire night can offer of what the Pirate Articles actually were and were not. They were a genuine, functioning system of law, agreed upon, enforced with real consistency, and in some respects more equitable than the naval and merchant systems operating alongside them. But they were also entirely dependent on the crew's own continued power to enforce them, a fragile, self-contained legal order with no appeal beyond itself, no higher court to answer to when the code was working, and absolutely no protection to offer once an external force with greater guns and greater legal authority decided the code simply didn't apply. Roberts's Articles promised 800 pieces of 8 for a lost limb. They promised a vote in every matter of importance. They promised, for the black sailors who'd signed them in good faith alongside everyone else, a share equal to any other man's. Not one of those promises survived contact with Cape Coast Castle. Among the individual defences that survive from the trial in enough detail to reconstruct, one in particular carries an odd echo back to a detail from earlier in this story. Several of Roberts's forced musicians, men taken specifically for their skill with a fiddle or a drum off captured merchant vessels, exempt, as you'll remember, from performing on the Sabbath under the same articles that governed every other aspect of shipboard life, argued at trial that their role aboard the Royal Fortune had never extended beyond entertainment, that they had never taken up arms, never boarded a captured vessel, never done anything beyond what any ship's musician anywhere might reasonably be asked to do. It was, in several documented instances, a successful defence, the court apparently willing to accept that a fiddler forced into providing music for a pirate crew's evening entertainment occupied a meaningfully different legal position than a gunner who'd fired on the king's colours. There's something almost unbearably poignant in that detail once you connect it back to the small, easy-to-miss clause in the Articles guaranteeing those same musicians a day of rest each week, a rule that on the ship had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with basic decency toward two exhausted men. At trial, that same distinction, between the men who fought and the men who merely played music while others fought, turned out to be the difference between a noose and a walk back into whatever life remained for them afterward. The code that protected a fiddler's Sunday aboard ship couldn't save him from the gallows on its own, but the fact of what he'd actually done, rather than what the crew around him had done, still mattered enough to a court with every reason to hang every man brought before it that a handful of musicians walked free when the proceedings finally closed. The trial itself moved with a speed that would be almost unthinkable in a modern courtroom, cases heard and decided sometimes within a single day. The commission working through dozens of defendants across a matter of weeks rather than months, driven partly by simple logistics, feeding and housing over 200 prisoners at a remote colonial fort was neither cheap nor safe for long, and partly by the straightforward political usefulness of a fast, visible conclusion. London wanted the Roberts problem solved decisively, publicly and soon, both to deter other pirates operating in the same waters and to reassure the merchant shipping interests whose losses to Roberts over 4 years had run into the hundreds of vessels. A slow, careful trial, however more just it might have been to the individual men standing before the court, served nobody's political interests the way a swift and visible reckoning did. What's left in the historical record is a set of trial transcripts that read, in places, almost like a strange mirror image of the ship's articles that opened this whole story, where the pirates' own code laid out clauses in advance, agreed to by every signature, applied afterward by procedure rather than whim. The court at Cape Coast Castle applied the law of a crown these men had never voted for, under statutes they'd had no hand in writing, judged by men who held every advantage of force and authority the pirates themselves once held over their own captives. 52 men hanged. Around 20 more sentenced to labour for the very company whose ships they'd once plundered. Dozens acquitted through the same forced man defence the pirate articles had, in a strange way, helped make legally coherent. And an untold number of black sailors, denied even the pretence of a trial, folded back into the machinery of the Atlantic slave trade, as though the years they'd spent as free, voting, equally compensated members of a pirate crew had never happened at all. It remains, to this day, the largest pirate trial ever conducted, and very possibly the clearest single-window historians have into exactly how far the Pirate Code's promises extended, and exactly where, with brutal finality, they stopped. 52 men hanged, dozens more sold back into the very trade some of them had once escaped by going to sea as pirates in the first place. The code that governed the Royal Fortune's crew for 4 years didn't survive the guns of M'Swallow by so much as an afternoon. And yet, in the centuries since, that same code, the vote, the compensation ledger, the 40 stripes lacking one, has outlasted every single man who signed it, remembered, studied, and in a strange way still argued about today far more thoroughly than the court that sentenced its authors to the gallows ever expected it to be. In September of 1749, a little over a quarter century after Bartholomew Roberts's death, the British Parliament consolidated and reissued the Articles of War governing the Royal Navy, the legal code every sailor serving the Crown, willingly or otherwise, was bound to obey. It's worth reading the two documents side by side, the pirate articles and the naval ones, because the contrast tells you almost everything you need to know about why so many sailors of the era, given the genuine choice, chose the Outlaw's Code over the King's. The 1749 Articles of War specified death as the mandatory penalty for a strikingly long list of offences, with little to no judicial discretion left to the officers applying them: cowardice, desertion, mutiny, even certain forms of simple negligence in the heat of battle, all carrying the same fixed sentence regardless of context or circumstance. A rigidity the pirate articles, for all their harshness, never quite matched. There was no vote involved at any stage of naval justice. A captain's authority over his crew was near total, backed by the full legal weight of the Crown, with none of the structural check that pirate crews built into their own system through the power to elect and depose their own leadership, and floggings under naval discipline, while nominally governed by regulation, were in practice frequently administered at a captain's individual discretion, for offences as minor as a slovenly uniform or a moment's insolence, with counts running into the dozens or, in extreme and well-documented cases, the hundreds, delivered across multiple sessions specifically because a single session of that. Severity would have simply killed the man receiving it. More than a dozen distinct offences under the 1749 Articles of War carried a mandatory sentence of death with the presiding court-martial given no formal discretion to substitute a lesser punishment regardless of circumstance, intent, or the defendant's record of prior service. A rigidity strikingly at odds with the case-by-case judgment you watched a pirate quartermaster exercise when he weighed Barnaby's stolen water ration against the sick man's need and settled on 15 stripes rather than 40. Courts-martial records from the Royal Navy across the 18th century do show officers and juries occasionally straining against that rigidity, finding creative legal grounds to acquit a sympathetic defendant or downgrade a charge specifically to avoid a mandatory hanging that struck the court itself as excessive for the circumstances. But the fact that naval officers had to work around their own legal code to achieve basic proportionality, while pirate quartermasters built proportionality into the ordinary, unremarkable exercise of their role, tells you something meaningful about which system, on paper, actually trusted its own judges to weigh a case on its individual merits. Beneath even the formal flogging sat something naval historians have come to call starting, the casual, entirely informal practice of a boatswain's mate striking a slow or clumsy sailor with a length of knotted rope called a starter, on the spot, without any pretense of a hearing, a sentence, or account kept by anyone at all. It wasn't punishment under the Articles of War. It wasn't punishment under any code whatsoever. It was simply violence, administered at will, by men with the authority to administer it and no obligation to justify a single blow. Set that against the pirate quartermaster counting each of Hollis's 40 stripes aloud in a flat procedural voice, and you start to see why the comparison matters so much to how historians have come to understand pirate governance. It isn't that pirate punishment was gentle. Nothing about the lash, the marooning, or the death sentence for concealing plunder supports that claim. And this whole night has tried hard not to pretend otherwise. It's that pirate punishment was, with real consistency, bounded, counted, applied according to a rule every man aboard had agreed to in advance, rather than dispensed at the unchecked discretion of whoever happened to be holding the rope that day. Merchant service, the third leg of the maritime world these men could have chosen instead of piracy, offered even less protection than the Royal Navy did, for all the Navy's own brutality. A merchant sailor served entirely at the pleasure of a private captain answerable mainly to the ship's owners back in port, with no equivalent of even the naval Articles of War's fixed, if severe, procedures. Wages could be withheld on the flimsiest pretext. Injury on the job carried no guaranteed compensation of any kind beyond whatever a particular captain's personal conscience happened to provide, which varied enormously and which no sailor could count on in advance. And the practice sailors called crimping, or, in a later and more infamous version, shanghaiing, being tricked, drugged, or simply kidnapped into service aboard a ship a man had never agreed to join at all, remained a genuine hazard around major ports throughout this period, and well beyond it. Weighed against that reality, the choice a captured merchant sailor faced when a pirate quartermaster asked him to sign the articles or stay behind starts to look considerably less like a choice between honest work and criminal violence, and considerably more like a choice between two different systems of exploitation, one of which happened to write its rules down, vote on its leadership, and pay its wounded in specie rather than empty promises. It's this comparison, more than any romantic notion of pirates as noble rebels, that drove the economist Peter Leeson to spend several years of serious academic research on pirate governance in the 2000s, publishing his findings first in a scholarly paper and later in a full book, released in 2009. That laid out the argument in detail for a general audience. Leeson's central claim, stripped of its academic apparatus, is straightforward. Pirates built the institutions they built, the vote, the checks on captains' power, the compensation scale, the written articles signed in advance, not out of any particular ideological commitment to fairness or democracy in the abstract, but because those institutions solved a genuine, practical problem that any organisation of armed, self-interested men operating outside the law would eventually have to solve or else collapse. Absent a king, a court, or any external authority to appeal to, pirate crews had to build their own mechanisms for resolving disputes, checking abusive leadership, and maintaining enough internal trust to function as a fighting unit at all. The articles were the solution they arrived at, independently, ship after ship, crew after crew, converging on remarkably similar answers because the underlying problem was, in every case, remarkably similar too. It's a colder, more economic explanation than the swashbuckling version of pirate history prefers, but it fits the evidence, the specific compensation numbers, the careful counting of lashes, the consistency of the vote across dozens of unrelated crews, better than almost any other theory historians have offered. The physical evidence for all of this sat quietly on the seafloor off the coast of Cape Cod for over 2.5 centuries before anyone found it. In 1984, an underwater explorer named Barry Clifford located and began excavating the wreck of the Wider Galley, a former slave ship captured by the pirate captain Samuel Bellamy in 1717 and lost, with most of her crew, in a violent storm off Massachusetts later that same year. The Wider remains, to date, the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever recovered and identified with confidence, its provenance confirmed in part by the discovery of a ship's bellboard, cast with the vessel's name still legible after more than 2.5 centuries underwater. What Clifford's team recovered wasn't gold, and jewels in the quantity popular imagination might expect, though there was plenty of that too. Coins and cannon, and a genuine pirate flag among the finds. It was also the quieter, more procedural evidence of exactly the system this whole night has walked through. Personal effects that let archaeologists reconstruct something of daily shipboard life, and confirmation, through the sheer diversity of the recovered crew's origins, that a pirate ship's company could include, as Bellamy's reportedly did, men of numerous different nationalities and, by several accounts, formerly enslaved Africans serving among the crew on the same articles as everyone else. The same complicated, double-edged reality tonight's earlier chapter on the Cape Coast Castle trial forced us to sit with rather than look away from. Bellamy himself is remembered, through Johnson's account, and therefore subject to all the same caution we've applied to that source throughout tonight, for a speech reportedly delivered to a captured merchant captain who declined the offer to join his crew, in which Bellamy is said to have contrasted his own men's chosen, voted upon leadership against the captain's submission to laws and rulers he had no hand in choosing. Whether Bellamy said anything resembling those exact words is impossible to confirm from a source as unreliable in its specifics as Johnson's general history proved to be, even in cases we can check against independent trial records. But the sentiment attributed to him lines up closely enough with the actual documented mechanics of pirate governance, the vote, the deposable captain, the written articles every man signed as an equal party, that even if the specific speech is invention, the underlying claim it makes isn't. Men who'd spent years under captains they never chose, serving laws they had no say in writing, found something aboard a pirate ship that the legitimate maritime world of their era simply didn't offer them anywhere else, a functioning, if brutal, say in how they were governed. That idea has outlived every ship it was ever tested aboard. Walk into a business school seminar today discussing flat organisational structures, worker cooperatives, or constitutional checks on executive power, and you'll occasionally find a case study built around exactly the pirate governance model this night has spent so many hours inside: the elected leadership, the separation of combat authority from day-to-day decision-making, the written compensation scale agreed to before any injury occurred rather than negotiated afterward from a position of weakness. It's a strange afterlife for a set of rules originally drafted by armed robbers to keep each other from mutiny, but institutions, it turns out, don't much care about the moral character of the people who first designed them. A good solution to the problem of unchecked power remains a good solution regardless of who worked it out first, and it happens, in this particular case, to have been worked out by men history has spent 3 centuries trying to decide whether to romanticize or condemn. The phrase itself has drifted even further from its origins than the governance model has. Pirate code today gets invoked, mostly in jest, to describe everything from office football pools to the informal rules governing a friend group's road trip, a linguistic descendant so far removed from Bartholomew Roberts's 11 signed clauses that most people using the phrase have no idea a document anything like the real one ever existed. There's something almost fitting in that erosion, though, because it mirrors exactly what happened to the men who lived under the actual articles. Their names, with a small handful of exceptions like Roberts and Bellamy, and the 2 women who beat the hangman through an accident of pregnancy law, didn't survive in any individual detail at all. What survived was the shape of the system they built, voted for, bled under, occasionally died by, outlasting every one of them by exactly the kind of margin that would have seemed impossible standing on the deck of the Royal Fortune in that final February off Cape Lopez, watching a Royal Navy warship close the distance with its guns already run out. There's a final irony worth sitting with before this story closes, one that ties the legacy chapter back to the trial that ended it, and to every punishment this whole night has walked through. The Cape Coast Castle Court that sentenced 52 of Roberts's men to hang did, in the course of its proceedings, something almost nobody at the time seems to have flagged as remarkable. It read portions of the pirates' own articles into the official record, entering them as evidence of the accused men's guilt, using the crew's own written rules against gambling, against desertion, against concealing plunder from the common stock, as proof that these men had operated a genuine, organised criminal enterprise rather than a loose band of opportunists. The very documentation that gave pirate crews their internal order and their surprising fairness became, in an English court of law, Exhibit A in the case for hanging the men who'd written it. There's no record of any defendant trying to argue the reverse, that a crew disciplined enough to write and enforce 11 clauses of internal law, compensate its wounded on a fixed schedule, and hold votes on matters of importance deserved some measure of the same legal recognition any other organised body might expect. That argument wouldn't have occurred to anyone in that courtroom in 1722, English law having no framework whatsoever for recognising legitimacy in an organisation built entirely outside it. But 300 years of hindsight, and a body of serious academic research examining exactly what these documents reveal about human cooperation under extreme pressure, have made that argument for them. Posthumously in university seminar rooms and museum placards these men could never have imagined existing. The Widers' recovered artefacts sit today in a museum on Cape Cod, a short drive from the beach, where the wreck itself still occasionally yields new finds after storms shift the sand covering it, more than 3 centuries after Samuel Bellamy went down with most of his crew in a single violent night. Visitors walk past display cases holding cannon, coins, a scrap of the ship's original bell, and placards explaining, in careful hedged academic language, exactly the kind of governance system this night has spent so many hours reconstructing: the vote, the compensation scale, the elected and deposable captain. It's a strange kind of monument, built not to honour men who were, by any reasonable modern accounting, violent criminals responsible for real suffering among the sailors and merchants they preyed on, but to preserve honestly the fact that those same men also built something worth studying, worth teaching, worth remembering with more nuance than either the swashbuckling adventure story or the simple morality tale usually allows. History rarely offers a clean verdict, and pirate governance, examined closely enough, refuses to offer one more stubbornly than almost anything else from this particular corner of the past. Harry Glasby, the carpenter-turned-officer whose repeated attempted desertions saved his life at Cape Coast Castle, is one of the rare figures from this entire story whose life we can trace with any confidence past the trial itself, and his afterward is worth pausing on before we close, because it offers something the rest of tonight's story has largely denied us: an ending that isn't a gallows, an island, or a silence in the record where a man's fate should be. Acquitted alongside a smaller group of forced men whose testimony corroborated each other's accounts of coerced service, Glasby returned eventually to something resembling an ordinary life on shore, his years aboard Roberts's ships behind him, his name preserved not because he was extraordinary in any dramatic sense, but because the specific, careful mechanism the pirate articles had unintentionally built, the practice of keeping certain forced men apart from full initiation, precisely so a moment like this trial might one day distinguish them from their more willing shipmates, happened to work exactly as intended in his individual case. It's a small, almost bureaucratic kind of survival, nothing like the swashbuckling escape a storybook version of this history might prefer. But it's real, documented, and it stands as the clearest evidence available that the code's promises, fragile and ultimately unenforceable as they proved to be against a court with no obligation to honour them, weren't entirely hollow either. Somewhere in the gap between the 400 to 600 ships Robert's crew captured over 4 years and the 52 men hanged for it, a smaller number of men like Glasby walked away, alive, because a rule written down years earlier in calmer waters by frightened men trying to protect their most vulnerable shipmates still meant something to a court that owed those shipmates nothing at all. What's easy to forget, standing in a climate-controlled museum gallery reading about compensation clauses under soft overhead lighting, is how none of it would have felt abstract to the men who actually lived under these rules. It wasn't a case study to Barnaby the Cooper. Watching Hollis take his 40 stripes lacking one under a tropical sun with the whole crew mustered to witness it. It wasn't an academic footnote to the carpenter who lost 2 fingers to a jammed capstan and stood, afterward, in front of 80 of his shipmates, while the quartermaster counted out his 800 pieces of 8, coin by coin. From a chest every man aboard had helped fill through months of genuine risk, and it certainly wasn't theoretical to the man Edward England became, begging for charity on Madagascar years after his own crew voted him onto a beach in Mauritius for the crime of extending mercy to an enemy he could just as easily have killed. The code these men built was, for all its later academic afterlife, first and foremost a lived thing, voted on, argued over, occasionally resented, occasionally trusted with something close to genuine faith, by ordinary, frightened, ambitious men trying to survive a version of freedom that came, as freedom so often does, with its own set of teeth. Picture the quill again, one last time, the one from the very start of tonight's journey, trembling in a new recruit's hand aboard the Royal Fortune, the same ship that would, within a year, take its captain's life off Cape Lopez and its crew's freedom at Cape Coast Castle. That single moment of signing contained, without anyone aboard fully realising it, almost everything this whole night has walked through since. The vote that would one day put a man ashore on a beach in Mauritius for the crime of mercy. The 40 stripes lacking one counted aloud, in a flat and careful voice, for a man caught sleeping through his watch. The 800 pieces of 8 waiting, already, for whichever unlucky hand would lose itself to a boarding action months down the line. The musician's quiet Sunday, and the same clause's strange, small power to save a fiddler's life in an English court years later. All of it was already there, folded into 11 clauses on a single sheet of parchment, before a single voyage had even begun. What made the code remarkable wasn't that it made piracy gentle. Nothing about tonight has pretended that. Men lost limbs, and were paid for them in the same breath a court would later refuse to recognise their humanity at all. A captain could run his ship by scrupulously fair procedure and still terrorise the merchant crews he captured without a flicker of the same restraint. A system built to protect its most vulnerable members, the forced men, the boys, the wounded, could do nothing at all to protect the 60 or 70 black sailors folded back into slavery the moment their ship's guns fell silent off Cape Lopez. The code was never a clean story. It was a human one, built by frightened, ambitious, often desperate men trying to survive a world that had already failed most of them once, long before they ever signed their names to a pirate's articles. And yet something in it held. Barnaby's 15 lashes for sharing water with a sick man, and the man's recovery 2 weeks later. Tam's biscuit pressed into his hand the same evening his gauntlet ended, and his own coin counted out in full months afterward when a cutlass found his arm. Aldous the carpenter, missing 2 fingers, choosing to stay aboard once his debt was paid, because the crew that owed him something had already made good on it. Harry Glasby, walking free from Cape Coast Castle because a rule written down in calmer waters still meant something, years later, to a court with every reason to ignore it and didn't. You're warm right now, wherever you're listening from. Your bed doesn't rock with the swell of open water. Nobody is going to muster you at the sound of a drum, and no quartermaster is standing by to count anything aloud tonight, on your back or into your open hand. That's the whole distance between you and every man this story has walked you through. Not virtue, not luck exactly, just 300 years and the simple, enormous fact of a warm bed under a solid roof. Let that be enough tonight. You're warm. You're safe. Whatever debts the world owes you, or you owe it, they can wait until morning. Sleep well.